Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Leaders Series. Today I'm speaking to J.C. Thompson, who's a global category lead for Kraft Heinz, and he's based in Amsterdam. He works within the procurement and specifically the workforce management space. And it was great to speak to someone as a recruiter that I've worked with over many years to really understand how these large global companies choose their partners, how they choose their suppliers, how they work with contingent workers, and also how they develop a plan for how they improve this and make it better for their own companies going forward. So really interesting chat. Hope you enjoy it. J.C. Thompson from Kraft Heinz. Hi there, JC. How are you?
I'm good, thank you, David. Great to be here. How are you doing?
I'm very well today. Yes, very well. Kind of getting through the year now. So coming up to kind of the Christmas, and my kids are getting excited about Halloween and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, the time is flying. So
absolutely, we're at the home stretch, as they say.
That's right. Yeah, good stuff. Good stuff. Well, we've got a real friend of GCS here, JC Thompson, someone that we've worked with over many years in various different companies. JC works for Kraft Heinz. He's based in Amsterdam. He's a global category lead. I'm going to say within the procurement space, but we're going to go into much more detail on which particular area of the procurement space that is. 10 years, a real rapid rise in the industry, and someone that GCS has worked with. And I think this will give us a real opportunity to talk about this, not overlooked, but not so much spoken about kind of area of business, which is, important and increasingly important in running these big kind of global firms. But without further ado, JC, great to see you. And maybe you can just, give our kind of listeners a little bit more, detail on what it is you particularly do and the kind of key priorities of your role.
Yeah, cheers, David. So as you mentioned, I'm the global category lead in Kraft Heinz, and the category that I look after is contingent workforce and BPO. This is actually a space that I've been operating in for a number of years now at different companies, as you mentioned, in Liberty Global and more recently at Heineken. But actually, what does contingent workforce and BPO actually entail? It's pretty much just the strategic vision of managing your external worker footprint. So a lot of companies are incredibly good and have very sophisticated ways of managing their full-time employees. But what contingent workforce and BPO looks at is how do you actually manage the workers who are not on your books? And how do you get the most out of those kind of contractual arrangements?
Yeah. And what, if you think about the key challenges for you within your role, and I know that you've gone on quite a lot to really take charge of real kind of big global projects. What are the initial challenges that come up to you straight away that you always have to kind of work out? Or is it different for each individual business?
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, there are differences from business to business, but, there's a lot of similarities, actually, and a lot of similar problems that large corporations are trying to face. When you look at contingent workforce BPO, I think the most obvious complexity is that who are your stakeholders? Well, there are such a large number of stakeholders in your organization, because a contingent worker can be anything from legal to audit, to finance, to IT, to engineering, to your supply chain, which means that you have to have a touch point with almost every single department in your entire organization. And then when you scale that up over continents, regions, globally, you start to realize just how big this picture is that you're trying to put together and how delicate the jigsaw is when you're trying to match everything one for another.
Yeah, and I guess you have to kind of create those templates and those structures, don't you, where everything's going to be different in different locations and in different divisions, but these are the kind of key cornerstones. And is that something that you've developed over time that you feel is really important to get these things right first?
Yeah, I think so. But it's also important to be aware of what's going on in the world, right? Because in this particular area of procurement, you're not dealing with a commodity, for example. You're dealing with people. You're dealing with people with feelings. And that adds extra complexity. Not only that, you're dealing with labor laws. And anyone listening to this will know that the law for managing externals in the UK is vastly different from Mexico.
Yeah.
So you constantly have to evolve, you constantly have to have your ears on the ground, and you're constantly having to partner with people. And that's what I really love about it, because you don't have to have global domination. It's about working out who the strategic partners are that you're going to trust and work with in order to find the best solution.
And when you go out looking for those partners, I mean, just before we go into the partner side, I certainly think on the labour laws. I mean, that is such a complex area, isn't it? You know, it's we talking the other day about tax law and how even in the EU, the tax laws are so different and the contractual laws are so different. You know, actually figuring it out is, and then it's always changing all the time, isn't it? You know, it's an almost impossible task, isn't it, really, to kind of get right?
Yeah, to an extent, many would say that. I think that's what keeps this area of business very interesting. Just to give you a few examples, you've got IR35 in the UK, which has turned the boat around there in terms of managing contractors in the United Kingdom. You know, when you look at the Netherlands, you've got VAP and DPA in terms of managing, again, payroll workers and the implications of that. If you look at very recently, in the last 6 months, Mexico has made temporary labor workers illegal, which actually means that everyone needs to be staffed through a service contract now. So, you know, just in a space of 12, 18 months, you've got 3 very, very sophisticated markets changing their entire modus operandi, and companies have to adjust to that.
That's right. Yeah. And the funny thing is that the thing I find as well with these sort of areas is it's very much seen as challenges, but people always find a way to, or companies, organizations, structures always find a way to continue the supply, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, that's why I felt the IR35. I mean, you've been in the industry long enough to know that IR35 was coming for, well, it was there, but it was coming for the way it works now for maybe 20 years. And then there was a day it happened, and now things have settled down and everyone understands how it works. And
Absolutely. With IR35, you know, the public sector kind of bore the brunt of that initial change, right? And everyone sort of knew that it was going to come to the private sector, secretly hoping it wouldn't. But eventually it did. But as you said, companies are resilient in that sense, you know, and the best companies are agile enough to work out a way to ensure business continuity. And I guess that's actually what my role is about, trying to work out how to create that business continuity.
Yeah, keep the main thing happening, which obviously in Kraft Heinz is producing the food, you know, and Liberty, you know, making the telecoms networks work, you know, Heineken, the beer, even more important, you know.
Absolutely.
Keep the beer flowing. And like you said, a lot of what you do as a leader within, you know, a category lead is obviously choosing and working with the correct partners.
Yeah.
Right. And I guess that you're very much judged on the quality of partner that you work with, right? You know, your success is based on that, I assume.
Yeah, very much so. I think, you know, in certain categories or in certain business lines, you can get away with working in a silo. You know, you can get away with working on your own and building your own strategy and saying, yes, this is the way forward. Unfortunately, in contingent workforce BPO, that's just not an option. You know, the dynamic of the category, the dynamism forces you to work with other people who, quite frankly, hopefully know more than you do.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm never embarrassed to say that I'm always looking for people who know more than I do.
You do know a lot, though, JC. I've worked with you for a few years now. You're pretty good.
Well, that's very kind, but it probably says something about GCS as well. So.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I tend to have most stuff in my head, but like you said, I think that's the same thing in partnership, isn't it? You know, you work with the companies that you supply to, and you know they're driving you in certain directions, and like you're talking about business resilience, you're trying to work out those solutions. You know, we work together on Dutch, the WAB and that sort of thing, and it's very much about trying to put the pieces together to make it all continue, isn't it?
And absolutely, and look, whatever company you're working in, the one thing to know about this particular area is that everyone is trying to solve the same problem.
Yeah.
Right. It is not a unique problem you're trying to solve, particularly when it comes to external workforce management. every single company is facing the exact same challenge. And you know what that means from a supply perspective? When you're working strategically with the suppliers, they're also able to share insights about what other people are trying to do to solve the same problem.
Yeah.
So it doesn't actually make sense to work in a silo, because ultimately what everyone is trying to achieve is the same goal. So that's why I prefer the much more collaborative approach, and actually speaking not only to my suppliers, but also to my peers and other companies.
Yeah, and I've noticed that about you, JC, and they kind of, you know, if you don't mind me saying, you've had quite a fast, kind of rapid rise to the level that you are. I guess within your role, while there is competition between the companies, you know, I've seen, because we've been on network events before and, you know, round tables, that you do lean and work with and collaborate with people kind of externally, don't you? And in this community, the procurement community seems to help each other quite a lot and share knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. Because like I said, you know, there are certain areas of procurement where you really do have to be careful, you know, and of course, even when we talk amongst our peers, there is always that line. You do not talk commercials, you do not talk contractual terms. But what we do talk about is the problem. Why is the problem there? You know, how could the problem be potentially solved? Now, that is talking about A and is talking about B. But what we don't really share too much about is how you get from A to B. But what we discuss are the potential routes that you can take to get from A to B. And like I said, you know what, you learn from a lot of people around you, and I'm always open to share. So.
Yeah, and when you talk to them, I mean, maybe if you were talking to someone, this is all about leadership. What are the key pieces of advice you always give to someone kind of coming into this or starting off a program, that how they should start looking at the problem?
Yeah, well, you know, it's very easy for people to say have the end in mind, right? When you look at solution design, the difficulty with looking at external workforce is the landscape is just simply changing so quickly that having the end in mind is quite difficult. Now, for some companies, the end in mind might simply be, we are better now than we were 5 years ago.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
That is a fantastic place to be. On the other side of things, you know, the end in mind could be, I want to create a total talent strategy. Yeah. And that could be, well, how do I incorporate, you know, our service workers in there, our temporary labor factory workers in there, our professional service workers in there. So for me, when you talk about how do you build that kind of holistic solution, the key really is to think about, well, what does my business need? Not what is the utopia. What does my business need? Because, for example, if you're working in a company that is let's take an Uber or a takeaway.com or something like that, which is very, very heavily on blue collar compared to white collar services, then your solution designing needs to be tailored to that need. Liberty Global, complete other end of the spectrum, predominantly white collar, software developers, etc. The solution design needs to be very tailored to that need.
Yeah, and the difference in the volume, the difference in the compliance, you need to kind of understand, you know, which market and which area you're working. So coming into this new organisation, because you haven't been in Kraft Heinz too long, have you?
No.
You're in the baptism of fire moments and all that sort of thing. What are the key challenges that you see ahead of you in the next year, that your key priorities?
Yeah, so you're right. I've only been a few weeks at Kraft Heinz now. I must admit, I'm already enjoying the challenge that is bringing. Truly global company and some wonderful brands. But you know, the challenge I think that Kraft Heinz really faces, and it's the same with many companies, is trying to understand where the workforce is going to go in the future. Now, if you look at what COVID-19 has done to workforce strategies over the last 18 months, 24 months, it's probably acted as a catalyst to change more than anything that has happened in the past. You know, people traditionally saying office-based working is the status quo, right? Well, very few people are reverting back to that status quo today. You know, then you start thinking about it in a more dynamic way, in a more strategic way, and you start thinking, well, you know what? If my external worker can work effectively 50 kilometers from my office.
Mm.
What's stopping that external worker from being 500 kilometers from the office?
That's right.
5,000 kilometers from the
Mm.
office. Now, don't get me wrong, there's a can of worms here where we start going into
compliance.
Exactly, compliance and legalities. But ultimately, we have a problem. And I think you and I know that if you have a problem, only sooner rather than later will a solution come.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So companies need to prep for that solution because I'm certain it's coming.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it goes back to the myriad of compliance laws in different countries and different tax laws. And you kind of think to yourself, I mean, who would do it? But you think to yourself, there must be an easier way. And there must be a way to balance this out so that everyone agrees. So there's certain key structures that are the same, you know. Interesting, I listened to a podcast the other day about standardized shipping containers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So someone in the past, in the 50s or whatever, invented the standardized containers they put on a ship. And they said it's one of the most important inventions that's ever been invented because it helps international global trade. You kind of think there should be something like that, some kind of key worker agreements that are standard for international workers. You know, that's something that occurred to me. I was thinking, I guess that would kind of help you, wouldn't it? You know, if there was some key structures.
I mean, for me, and I'm sure my HR colleagues would agree, or actually any hiring manager would agree, if we can get a more streamlined way of getting access to the best talent in the world, irrespective of where they are, that's a huge win.
Yeah, exactly. No, it was an interesting a Game Changers podcast. So yeah, it was a good one. It tells you how they invent stuff, if you know what I mean. And you know, you yourself, you just talked about the kind of global workforce there. Do you only see that increasing, you know, particularly in the contingent worker side, where people are looking for inches and more efficiencies and, you know, following the sun?
Yeah, I think so. If I'm very honest with you, I think like I touched upon that COVID-19 has proved the capability to actually work with specialists. Now, don't get me wrong, there are certain areas and certain domains, and you know, in some companies there might even be certain reasons why you want key decision makers to be making decisions in certain territories or even certain offices, right? But by and large, if you were to remove that kind of restriction and you look at the wider talent pool that an organization has, the war for talent is apparent. So you know, there are people, just look at the Eastern European countries at the moment and what they're doing in the IT space.
Yeah,
you know, they're here to stay, and they're certainly not going to back down from the fight in terms of getting access to the best jobs on the market. So I think a company needs to move to where the talent is, and the talent needs to be prepared to flex a little bit as well.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think it is a kind of push and pull moment, isn't it? And just to go back to what you said about the kind of the blue collar versus the white collar, is that maybe something you kind of worry about? Obviously, I'm assuming, like, you know, people work in factories, people work in manufacturing establishments. There's already quite a divide in terms of, you know, salary or working conditions. But do you fear that might be something that does cause friction going down the line? Is it something that you see as a problem, maybe?
Potentially. I think it will cause a problem for the companies who really don't focus on their workforce plan over the next 2 to 3 years, you know, because the shortage of talent isn't confined to, let's say, professional or let's say white collar, or however you want to define it. Take a look at what's happening. Let's use UK as a case in point. Truck drivers.
That's right.
Right. And we only have to look back on the news over the last couple of days to really see the shortage of truck drivers and the impact that has on everyday life.
Yeah.
And then if you actually ask anyone in a manufacturing site right now, I can guarantee you forklift truck drivers are a diamond that they're trying to find.
Yeah.
So it's not all, you know, sometimes we get caught up a little bit on the sexy stuff like the data scientists and the software engineers, etc. But believe me, the shortage of talent is there across the scale. And that's why companies really need to wise up in terms of working out, you know, how do we end this shortage? I know of companies, for example, who are using virtual reality training for forklift truck drivers, so that
Wow.
you can try and speed up the capability increase and upskilling necessity that comes along with that shortage. So it's a really fascinating space, David, in truth.
Is that the way you kind of use the kind of innovative, kind of, you've talked about partners and suppliers, but do you also look at, you talked there about a workforce plan. Is that something you work according to? So,
Yeah, I think so. So in certain companies, that plan is owned by different people. In core HR, sometimes it's in talent acquisition. Procurement plays a role. Sometimes procurement doesn't play a role. But ultimately, the good companies know exactly how they want to resource their future deployment of core products or services.
Right. Okay.
And how they go about that is obviously individual to each and every company. But if you don't have a strategy underpinning that, you're going to get unstuck eventually.
Yeah, that's right. And it's important to kind of work towards that. But like you said, also, be flexible around that as legislation changes, as economic or, pandemics, that sort of thing. And for you, within the industry that you've worked within, and you've been within the food industry, as it were, for quite a lot of your career, obviously, not only. Do you see any kind of key changes? Obviously you're looking at the contingent workforce within that, but how is that developing? Or how have you seen that develop over the last decade?
Yeah, so if we're looking at FMCG and in particular, I would say the tech revolution is probably the biggest thing that's happened. You now look at companies which I've worked at, let's say Associated British Food, Heineken, even Kraft Heinz now. They are fastly becoming tech companies.
Right.
Everyone is quickly moving into this data-driven organization space, because the power of data, the power of big data, is starting to be realized not just by the guys in Silicon Valley, but actually by every company that there is. And the improvements that using data to drive improvement measures in your supply chain, for example, is significant. Look at things like sustainability agendas, which have just come on in the last 5 years in particular. I know people have talked about it for much longer than that, but actually you are really starting to see big companies making sizable commitments to the market about what they are going to do in sustainability between now and 2025, between now and 2030. You're also seeing social pressures on these big companies, such as removing child labor, removing modern slavery. No one wants to be associated with a brand which is not doing what we call now the basics right. And that kind of pressure is also really forcing companies. You're starting to see people who for the first time probably in the last 4 or 5 years, you're having in a HR function, you've got I&D directors, inclusion and diversity directors.
Yeah.
And all of this is coming because of the social pressures that we simply expect more as a society from big companies these days.
And that also links in, because you, particularly on the I&D side, the diversity and inclusion side, sometimes that's like you went back to the permanent staff, we need to work on this, but I think you've always been quite big on making sure that's within the contingent workforce as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. Like I said, for me, I maybe have a slightly different view on workforce. I see a talent pool rather than a workforce. And therefore, I believe that if you have one vision for your talent pool, that should apply to the entire pool. So that can be things like promoting women in tech initiatives is a classic one, for example. But it's really great to see more and more companies actually investing in this kind of space. Yeah,
exactly. Brilliant. Well, JC, it's been great to speak to you today, and I really enjoyed it. And it's great to have a bit of insight into the machinations of these like these categories in the background. But one of the things that on the leadership side, what would you say as you've kind of grown your career from Ministry of Sounds all the way through to kind of Kraft Heinz? What's the key thing you've learned on your journey as a leader within this sector and within this industry?
For me, it's actually quite a simple rule that I follow. And although it's simple, it can be hard to follow at times. And that is to always put aside your kind of self-bias that you have. And every decision that you make, every thought process that you go down, just ask yourself the same question: is this absolutely the right decision for the company?
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And if you can always honestly answer that question with yes, then I believe that you are always putting one step forward. It doesn't mean you're not going to come up against resistance, because there might be other people with a different view who are also answering yes to that question. But ultimately, the end product that you're going to agree on will be beneficial for the organization, right? And that's kind of the way that I've always approached things. I've always viewed it of the lens of my company, treat every euro, dollar, pound as my own, and do the basics right and go from there.
Okay, JC, some quick fire questions for you as a member of the leaders. So what got you into the industry?
I wish I could say that I was always born to do procurement, or I knew this was where I was going to end up, but actually it's not true. I think in my early years, if you asked me, I wanted to be a sportsman or a radio DJ. So I guess you're kind of giving me a glimpse into what my life could have been if I made some different choices here. But no, all in all, the reason why I actually ended up choosing procurement is because I graduated out of law school, and I felt that procurement gave me that really nice balance between the legal and the commercial negotiation, which actually gives me the energy that I need to get up and go to work every day.
Brilliant. And what does success mean to you?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think I wear a lot of hats, like many people. And for me personally, it's keeping my family happy, keeping myself happy, making sure that we're all motivated, that we're comfortable, and we don't have too many stresses. But if you look at it from a professional point of view, again, I have different nuances. So aside from my full-time job, I'm also a founding partner of a consultancy firm in the Netherlands called Workforce Consulting. And if you were to ask me what does success look like for workforce consulting, well, that would be to enable companies who really want to make transformational changes to have the confidence to actually do it. So that's what success looks like there. If you were to ask me what does success look like for Kraft Heinz in my role in Kraft Heinz, well, that is simply just following what I believe is one of the best mottos that a company can have, and that is doing better each and every day, and hopefully making each of my stakeholders happier as I go along and do it.
Wonderful. Wonderful. What's the one thing you're most excited about this coming year?
Oh, wow. The one thing that I'm most excited about. Gosh. Well, I guess from a personal perspective, I'm going to have to say that my wedding is pretty important. Yeah, so if I don't say that, if I don't put that in, David, I'm in trouble. So yeah, number one has to be the wedding coming up in 2022. But other than that, I must admit, I'm a people's person. So doing work behind a lens has been great. I've been able to do it. I've been able to work efficiently, like many people have, but I'm really excited to get back out there. I'm really excited to see my suppliers, to see my colleagues, to see my clients, to get out to conferences, to have this face-to-face interaction. And I'm certain that I'm not the only one who's absolutely hoping that comes sooner rather than later.
Yeah, it's great. Great to be back. Great to be back.
Exactly.
Name another company that inspires you, and why is that?
Yeah, that's quite a tricky question. I think I'm going to have to be a bit diplomatic here. Yeah. But you know what? I've been very, very privileged to work at companies, all of which have inspired me for different reasons.
Sure.
Actually, I've never joined a company where I wasn't inspired by what they were trying to achieve. And looking back, even as the early starter back in my Ministry of Sound days, what a company that was in terms of its vision. Most people know it for the nightclub in London and producing great events, but this is also a company that was started by a small group of people who just believed in something greater than what was available. And they went on to build one of the most successful record labels in Europe. And you scale that into a company like Heineken, right? And Heineken, for me, is still the best beer brand in the world when you look at it from a marketing campaign perspective. You know, it's genius what some of the stuff that they do. And then, of course, now in my role at Kraft Heinz, it's inspiring to see what such a large company is willing to completely change and transform itself again. And people will be asking the question, but why? You seem to have the secret sauce already. That may be the case, and the pun is intended.
Yeah.
But you know, they are willing to be brave enough to flip things upside down, and that's exactly what inspired me to join them.
Brilliant. What's the favorite project that you've supported to date?
So on a favorite project, I think the one that I've probably had some of the most satisfaction out of is during my time at Heineken. And it was actually during one of the toughest periods in the company's history. COVID-19 just hit, and I'm sure everyone knows the pubs and the restaurants were closed for too long, shall we say, and everyone wanted to socialize but couldn't. Because of that, Heineken went through actually their toughest year since World Wars. And I can't disclose too much about the project just because of the nature of the project itself. But what we really had to do is to think very strategically about how we could change and adjust and adapt the total workforce strategy globally for the company in order to ensure that that company was able to go on and continue to deliver the best product they could deliver to the customer wherever and whenever they wanted it. And we made tremendous impacts into the bottom line. And like I said, it was during the hardest period the company's ever been.
The real challenge of COVID in that sort of environment. So it's great to see it all coming through and coming to success. Okay, so what's one of the best pieces of business advice you've ever received?
Gosh, I've said this, I think, before on one of the panels that I've been on in the past, and it was said to me very early on in my career, and that is choose your mentor and choose your boss well, not necessarily your job.
Yeah.
Because mentors and your bosses are ultimately the ones who will give you the opportunities to thrive, to explore, to grow yourselves, right? So especially anyone who's starting out their career, you know, a lot of people get attracted to the fancy names, the glitz and the glamour of certain companies, and maybe they might even make choices purely because of what market perception is. But I guarantee you that if you choose your boss well, if you choose your mentor well, everything else will fall in line.
Fantastic. What do you think will change the industry most over the coming 24 months? It's been a year of 24 months of great change. What do you think is the next big change? Yeah.
So in the workforce industry, I think we're going to see a massive revolution in tech, right? So I think, like I said, COVID-19 has completely remodeled the way that companies are working and colleagues are operating with one another. And because of that, I think you're going to see tech companies popping up. I'm already starting to see them now, which is enabling easier payrolling for international workers. You might even see things like recruitment companies really moving into the tech space to see how can they disrupt what is a relatively, you know, traditional way of recruitment. So that's what I think. I think tech's going to be the big enabler and is coming at the HR industry incredibly quickly.
And what do you think the workforce industry's main challenge is at the current time?
I think it's going to be adjusting to the wants and the wishes of their employees. You know, when you look at what CEOs are talking about at the moment, it's an incredibly hard challenge that CEOs have, and they're all saying that attracting and retaining talent is probably their number one challenge for their organization. If you look at, you know, a couple of reports, I read one quite recently from Korn Ferry, which said they were anticipating that around 85 million jobs globally will go unfulfilled by 2030, just because there are not enough skills on the market. 85 million jobs globally. That's a staggering fact. But again, companies are going to have to work out how do they make sure that they're not part of that statistic. So it's going to be really interesting.
Sure. The last question, what do you think the main difference is that you see in industry now pre and post COVID-19?
Yeah, I've touched upon it a couple of times already. I think it's that whole remote working debate. And I know that there are people who are still sitting on the fence or are sitting on the other side of the fence that perhaps are very much
in the office.
Exactly. So far off the fence, they're in the office. Exactly. But I think that is the debate that we cannot ignore. Right? And I think depending on certain sectors, of course, if you were to look at certain public sector services, it's not an option. Right, but there are many jobs and many companies who can explore this option and probably will explore this option, and they'll see whether it can become a long-term solution for them. Again, just looking at a couple of reports, I remember looking into one which PwC published, which stated that around 84% of the employees that they actually interviewed believed that they were doing equal or better working from home than they were when they were in the office. But that's of course the employee opinion. So I'm going to be very curious to see whether the employers go along with that narrative.
That's right. And like you said, it's data driven, isn't it? You know, you'd probably be able to do the data now to find out whether that's actually kind of true or not. So technology helping again. So great speech, JC. Have a great afternoon. Thanks very much.
Cheers, David. Thank you.